All right, since you're the first one, I'm going to say we should be recording now. on
Okay.
my on my end, we're good to go. Cool. So today we have Luke Johnson from RMA, and we've got Brian Hitzegrath from RMA as well. Luke is a lighting designer and lighting guy, and Brian is a sound designer and lighting guy. So Luke, why don't we start with you? Go ahead and kind of introduce what you do and who you are.
Hi, my name is Luke Johnson. I am currently the production manager for the Duke Energy Center for the Performing Arts. So I oversee production for all 4 spaces we have there. Historically, my background is in lighting. I spent about 20 years in professional event lighting of all sorts. Theater and concert work and political and corporate work. And then that's what I went to school for. My degree is in lighting design from School of the Arts. And I don't get to do as much of that as I wish I could at this point in my life, but it's okay. It's all a trade-off. So that's a quick summary.
Awesome. Brian, how about you?
My name is Brian Hitzegrath. I'm one of the production supervisors, one of 4 that work under Luke at Memorial Auditorium. My background is in sound, theatrical, corporate, professional, concert. I've done it all. I did a brief stint touring, running sound for a couple bands. I've worked as a designer for several regional theaters, as well as colleges, and mixed several live shows over my tenure as a stagehand for RMA. And that's pretty much where I'm at. I did not go the traditional college route. I went more of a apprenticeship route. My family has always done this. My father did this. So I started working with him when I was a teenager, and here I am now, 20 years later.
Awesome, man. Awesome. So I think my first question is, you both kind of talked about live production versus, say, Luke, you said something like political events. Brian, you're talking about industrials or what am I saying?
Corporate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So can you explain, for those that may not know the difference, can you kind of explain what that entails? As far as like when you do a show, you're reading a script and you're getting hints from the script on how you're going to light things. But if you're doing something like an event at the convention center, what would be the difference? Luke, you want to start with that?
Sure. So in the end, with all lighting, the goal is to be able to see whatever you want to see and not see what you don't want to see. That being said, corporate work is a lot more sterile. It's much more focused around lighting what is on the stage, lighting the presenters. You might have some sort of party or something afterward that you're gonna do some fun, exciting, colorful, creative lighting with. But it's very kind of by the numbers, a lot of corporate stuff. You just want things to be well lit, and now more than even it used to be, make sure that it's all very even and flat lighting, because you want for recording purposes or any broadcast purposes, especially if it's political events, you want to have an even lighting field across the whole stage, so that you don't have hot spots and low spots. The opposite sort of is true for theater. Normally that's not filmed or recorded, so it's much more designed to the eye, to the space. And it is, like you said, it's all about lighting to the script, lighting to the direction. So it's much more collaborative, and as far as working with the directors and other designers for theater. For a lot of corporate lighting, you just go in there, you make it look good and appropriate, and then you kind
So
of.
do you have someone that you have to like talk to, like the director wise, or do they say, here's the space, go ahead and light it?
It's a little bit of both. Some corporate events, you know, are organized by like the fourth accountant, and they don't have a clue what's going on, and they just say, come in and light the show, and we trust you, do your job. Sometimes you get someone that really thinks they know what's best and really wants to have a creative input into the situation. And that's, you know, either or, they're both fine. So you have to kind of feel out the situation as needed. And then political stuff is, like I said, it's you're lighting for TV for the most part. So you will be discussing things with the cameramen and the TV directors and stuff like that. And you do talk to whoever's organizing the event to say, you know, here are the things that are happening. So sometimes you do have lighting cues even within corporate shows, like, you know, there might be a speech followed by a film projection, a video projection of some sort, followed by a band or something sometimes playing as well. So, you know, you do still follow a structure. It's just sometimes you have a stage manager type person calling things. Sometimes you're doing that all on your own. It depends on the size and scale of the event. So they're all a little different in the sense of how you kind of interact with different people. But the lighting is a lot of times it feels like you're loading in the same front light package every time for the loud shows.
So, Luke, I want to come back to a question that you brought up, though, that I know my students are going to bring up, which is lighting for television as well. But I think we can talk about that in a couple of minutes. Brian, I want to kind of get your, you know, from the same question, what's kind of your feel on when it comes to corporate shows?
I mean, I think for me, the biggest difference between corporate or theatrical or concert production is just the scope of it. You know, theatrical work, you know, I'm looking at dozens of microphones on a given show just for actors. And then you've got a whole pit orchestra that you have to deal with, you know, bringing in massive arrays of speakers and different effects speakers to place throughout the venue. On a corporate show, I'm looking at maybe a half dozen things, you know, a few speakers discreetly placed. They don't want to see it, but they want clarity everywhere in the room. So it's a much simpler process for sound for corporate 99% of the time. There are certainly exceptions. We had Disney do a shareholders meeting at Memorial last month, and that was a massive production. That was, you know, a 3-day load in so that they could do a 2-hour shareholders meeting followed by a screening of Mulan, which is certainly atypical for my corporate work, but it does happen.
So I know this is going to come up later on in the discussion. I want to make sure that I touch on it now is something that we talk about in class a lot is when you talk about the arrays, the speaker arrays and things like that, is if you have the speaker or the microphone in front of that and you start getting feedback and all that type of stuff. Can you like, I don't know if quickly is the right word, but can you describe how you deal with something like that, where if the event is happening and you start getting a little bit of feedback, how are you countering that feedback? Like, what do you do to set it up so that you have minimal feedback? And then what do you do in the middle of the production when feedback happens?
Sure. So one of the biggest advantages we have at that level is that these PAs give us a lot of headroom to work with, so it's less of a problem at that level. That being said, we do spend a lot of time when the system first gets installed on a given show, EQing it and making it as flat as possible, so we adjust for any frequencies that tend to feedback in the room. And then in the event that we're fortunate, we have several days to rehearse. So if we do find there are areas where we're feeding back, we figure out, well, is it coming from the monitors? Is it coming from this PA? Is it something that's happening all the time or just in this one scene where they happen to be in this one problematic place? At which point we adjust EQs, or, we've adjusted placements of speakers because we didn't think about, oh, there's a 2-story set and all of a sudden they're 5 feet beneath the speakers that are in the air instead of 30 feet beneath the speakers that are in the air. And it's years of experience lets us make some of those tweaks on the fly, just being able to dive into an EQ and hearing what that frequency is and quickly pulling it out. That being said, step one is always just bring the mic down.
That's usually what we do is hit mute quick. You just cut that signal and you're good to go. All right, Luke, let's see, where was that question? What's been your favorite show that you've ever worked on?
So I'm going to cheat and have a couple. From a stagehand point of view, my favorite show I've ever run was Lion King. When I was much younger and that was first touring, I got to run one of the, I believe, 8 follow spots for that show. And I happened to be located right behind the stage right array. So I could sing and dance and no one could see me or hear me, and it was wonderful. And that was, a good 5 or 6 weeks we worked on that show. And I had fun the whole time. The cast was great. The crew was great. I got to learn a lot and see a lot of really interesting things. And I just love that show. So that was my favorite from that side of things. My favorite show I've ever designed, and it was another one that was just happened to be the right cast and crew. I did Buddy Holly story, the musical Buddy Holly, down in Southern Pines in this little tiny theater down there that's a restored movie theater. And it was just a really special production. It was not by any stretch of imagination anything very big, or we didn't have a huge budget, but that one has always really stuck with me. It was the right perfect storm of cast and crew and creative talent. And
I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because I do think that is a major factor. Like when I think about the shows that I've worked on, I think some of my favorites, the actual props that I built may not have been all that terribly dynamic, but it was the crew that you worked with and the actors are fun, and like the overall experience of that production. That's a good point.
Yeah,
Brian,
I mean, so it's not always about having the coolest and biggest toys, though
right.
that helps. Sometimes it's just having the right chemistry with the right group of people, and it's just a really good production.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that one. Brian, do you have a favorite?
Oh, so many. From a design perspective, I think probably The Little Mermaid, which I did at a small theater in Fayetteville a few years back. It's just a fun show in general, and I got to do some cool things with sound effects for it because of the nature of the show, all the magic and that sort of thing. From a stagehand perspective, it's probably Little Shop of Horrors, just because that is one of my favorite shows of all time. Yeah. And I had finished my time up as an intern with North Carolina Theater, and 2 seasons later they were doing Little Shop and they needed someone, and I volunteered for that. And it's the last show I ever volunteered to do, but I did it because I love that show so much.
That is a fun show. I enjoy that. So when you're talking about favorite shows and things like that, what has been, trying to think of the way to word this question, is what's been like an issue that's come up, like a really tough issue that you had to figure out like on the fly? I could read the question word for word, but so they say, what is the hardest object you've ever had to build, but that you haven't really necessarily built? So I'm trying to think of a way to put that, is like, what's been the hardest challenge you've had on a show, Brian?
So I actually do have, to an extent, a hardest thing I've had to build, in that we did Billy Elliot with North Carolina Theater a few years back, and that is very obviously a tap-heavy show. And so the thought was that we would use tap mics on all of the ensemble, which meant I had to thread mic elements through little pockets that were sewn into the overalls of these costumes. so that they didn't have to change mics and get into mics. They just put these overalls on and they had tap mics. That was a 6-hour project that on the second day of tech, they decided we don't actually need those microphones. They're tapping loud enough. You can go ahead and pull those back out.
Curses. Interesting. Luke, do you have one that's been kind of a major challenge?
Yeah, there's always things like Brian talked about, and I think it's true with any department where you'll have a great plan, and it can be an objectively great plan before you get into the space. And then if you get into the space and you start working with all the cast and with all the other departments, and it just doesn't kind of work out the way you think. So there's any number of examples like that. I can think of recently, about a year, 2 years ago, we were doing a show up in Fletcher Theater, and I don't know what happened exactly. I don't think we've ever gotten the official word, but we lost power. There was a big power issue in Fletcher, and we basically lost power to the whole theater.
I remember
And
that.
we had a dance company that was in, and so, they had put a lot of work in, all the kids had put a lot of work in, and we wanted to make sure we could do something for them. So I ended up going up to the lighting shop and renting a very, very small, very, very basic package. And we ended up running power from Memorial and pulled in some lighting and some power distribution and stuff, and set up a really rudimentary lighting plot in Fletcher that was pulled, like I said, from Memorial. And then I believe Brian was there too and got the sound up and running.
I did, yeah.
It was a big team effort from a lot of people. And that's gonna always be the common thread, I think, in theater, is that it's always a big team effort. But we basically got a new theater set up lighting and sound wise in about an hour or so, and then got their show off, and it wasn't anything like anyone had planned on, but it all worked out well, and they were happy, and it was definitely an interesting experience. And I think we started like 20 minutes later, something like that, and then everything else started on time the rest of the day. So it was a strange day, but that's the exciting part to me about theater, and is problem solving and overcoming challenges like that. So yeah, there are hard things and you have tough days, but that's the fun of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't ever want anything to go wrong, and I don't want it to come across that way, but when things do go wrong or you have these challenges, that's the most exciting time to me.
I would agree. I think that I'm glad to hear you say that particular story, because we've definitely had things like that happen, even on the high school level. I mean, it's going to happen anytime in live theater, no matter what level you're on. And, it's how you work as a group. I remember Mary Poppins, things would break on it, and in between shifts, we'd run off with it quick and we'd put it all back together, and it'd go on for the next shift, and nobody in the audience would ever know. And then I know there have been others where, we had the governor come and do a speech at the school one year. And of course, once he gets there, like you're saying, with the whole television and the lighting and stuff like that, all of a sudden you have to adjust lighting, or you have to adjust the sound, and you're not really supposed to get anywhere close to him, or whatever the case is. And he's not as tight as, say, the president, but still, there's some things in there that you have to be careful of, but or the challenges. You have to trust your crew is one of the best, at least at the high school level, and I know it goes all the way up to your guys' level, is when you can look at anybody on the crew and say, hey, I need you to get this, this, and this. I need 2 XLRs that are 10 feet or something like that, and they know exactly what you're talking about. Trusting. So I'm going to move into some of the details. Brian, my student, he's got 3 very highlighted questions, and I think it goes specifically to what we were working on. We're in the middle of tech for Footloose. And we've got a Yamaha LS9, does that sound right? Soundboard. And he can run it digital. He can run it through his iPad. And so we're talking about clipping and things like that. So his full question is, what is clipping, and is it due to the signal from the pack not reaching the receiver, or possible vice versa?
So clipping is actually quite the opposite. Is anytime you're getting too much signal at any point in your process, whether it be at the receiver getting too strong a signal, which is very rarely a problem. That usually means your receiver and your transmitter are right next to each other. Or at the console, if you turn up the gain too high, you start to clip there, and ultimately at your output, you start overdriving your amps. And essentially what it means is, sound comes in waves, and the clipping is when you're basically cutting off the extreme ends of that. So it's not being processed. You're not getting the fidelity you want or the clarity you want.
So how do you go about fixing that particular issue? If you're getting clipping, what would be the best?
So you kind of have to look at where in the process it's happening. If it's happening at the receiver, you're probably looking at a wireless frequency issue. And it's not so much that it's not getting there, but probably more than one transmitter is hitting that receiver and overdriving the signal.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Anything past that, you start looking at your gain structure at the input, how hard you're outputting, how hard you're driving your amps. But it sounds like in this specific case, he's asking more about him seeing that little red light on the receiver that says clipping. Yeah. And that's probably the best thing is there's a few different free resources you can look at to find out what the best place to start with your wireless frequencies is. And then, as you get to a higher level, the professional level, we have some great software that we can plug in 5 different types and brands of transmitters and over the course of 80 transmitters, and says, these are all the frequencies you should be using. Here's your spare frequencies. This is what the radio station across the street is using, and does all that math for us, which even 10 years ago was something that we had to do manually, and it was a lot of math.
And you have to do that, with some frequency at work, right, Brian?
I do. We actually run, it's a software called IAS. We run it once a year just to account for any new TV or radio things that have come up, anything the college across the street is doing. We check it out about once a year and then go through our entire system and reprogram all the receivers.
Awesome. As Caroline says hello.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Caroline.
Hi, guys. Good to see you. Bye, guys.
I don't know about that shirt.
I know. As he's wearing his Michigan shirt. My Badger shirt was, this interview went. All right, Brian. His second question. This one has got a bunch of questions, and I don't know enough about this, so I'm going to say all the questions in this one question. Great. And then you tell me what's going on here, because it may not be right. What is the proper way to go about EQing? Do I focus on subtracting or adding frequencies, or is it random for everyone? Are high pass filters always a good idea? Same question for low pass filters.
So I'm sure if you looked at a textbook, they could say there is a proper way to go about EQing. In my experience, subtracting or reductive EQing is usually more what you want to do. You want to pull out the things you don't want to hear instead of trying to boost the things you do want to hear. Ultimately, it balances out to be the same thing. If you boost every tiny thing that you want to hear, that's the same as having pulled the things you don't want to hear, but you have then added gain to the structure, because you've increased those volumes instead of pulling things you don't like. That being said, every situation is unique. Sometimes that is what you have to do. I have a couple EQs that I start with by default pulling certain things and just doing a broad increase on certain other things. High pass filters, I'm guessing in this case he's thinking of vocal mics, in which case a high pass filter is always a good thing. because there are certain frequencies that the human voice just does not produce. But if you leave those in your EQ, and I'm thinking, you know, a lot of the subsonic frequencies, the stuff that's great on a bass guitar or kick drum can feed back very easily in a vocal mic if you don't pull that out. Low passes are a bit more subjective. I'm more inclined to use a low shelf, which is like a pass, except instead of cutting everything above a frequency, it subtracts just a little bit of everything from above that frequency, or increases just a little bit. So I'll oftentimes put a little bit of a low pass or a low shelf increase on vocal mics to add some brightness to them. And I think that's all of the questions in there. Yeah.
Yeah, that was awesome, man. So I got one more for you, Brian, and then I'll jump back over to Luke for a bunch. So be ready, Luke.
I'm ready.
What is compression, and how do I go about doing that? And then he says in parentheses, if it is too vague a question, I understand that.
No, it's a great question. Compression is essentially these days it's available in most consoles as a software feature, but it's a device we use to decrease the maximum volume of something and increase its lowest level, which is great on vocals. You know, if you get someone who's yelling or very belty, it brings that down some, and you can set a ratio of how aggressively it does that and how quickly it does that. But it also boosts whatever their lowest volume is. So when they've got dialogue that they're whispering, you've got just a little bit more push to it. It is kind of a trial and error thing. It's, again, I'm sure there's a textbook that says this is the correct way to do it. It took me years, really, when I was starting off to really grasp how it worked. And it wasn't until I got into more digital stuff where I could visualize what was happening that it made sense to me. And that is fortunately something you can do with the console he's got. He can look at his compressor and it shows just a curve, and you can see signal input versus how much is being taken away.
Yeah, and the console is awesome for all that type of stuff. So.
Yeah.
You guys both know I am more of a carpenter. I'm a props guy, really, and I build scenery. So some of these questions for you, Luke, I think are probably ones that I probably could have answered, but I don't know enough about what you do, so we're going to ask you. Let's see. Oh, right. How many different lighting angles do you primarily use to light up actors? So if you have one actor at center, how many different lighting angles are you doing to hit that one actor?
So all of my answers probably for all of this are going to start with, well, it depends. You know, it depends on what you're trying to achieve in your lighting. Sometimes you only want one key light that's on the person, and you might have a really nice beam effect that you're getting through some haze, and it's just this really gorgeous scene you're trying to create with a single or key light, and then maybe a little fill from the other side that's of a contrasting color, something like that. Sometimes, if it's like I was saying before, if it's just a political thing or you're lighting for TV, you know, you want them to be well lit from all angles. So, you know, maybe that's some front light and some side light. Maybe that's a McCandless system, which is two 45-degree angle lights to kind of imitate front light. You know, if it's dance, you want to use a lot of down light and side light. You know, dance is all about accentuating the form of the dancer. It's all about sculpting the human body. Whereas a straight play is really just about lighting the actors, and generally speaking, as it's described in the script. You know, a lot of straight plays, and not all of them, because of course it depends. But a lot of straight plays, you're not doing as much creative lighting. You're doing representative lighting of what that scene should look like to those people at that time. If it's a musical, it's a lot of really big, exaggerated lighting, especially in the big musical numbers. Where then when you get to the book scenes in the musical, you kind of trend more toward very functional lighting like you would do in a straight play. You don't ever get quite that realistic, generally speaking, in a musical, but you kind of you go from these book scenes that are a little more subdued, a little bit more realistic, to these big bombastic things that are over the top and have a lot of color and a lot of texture and a lot of things like that in them. So um, it depends. Ideally, for me, and I think for most designers, um, you're gonna want to be able to light most most people in most parts of the stage from as many different angles as possible, so that you have options when you get into the space. Because one of the big differences, I think, between lighting design and many of the other um, uh, disciplines in theater is that nothing the lighting designer has done, or none of their work is done really before they get into the space. The set design is done, the costume designs are done, the props are done, even a lot of the sound stuff is set up, hopefully. Um, and not to say that sound is the other department that does a lot of their work in the space, but all of it for the lighting designer, for the most part, other than figuring out where you want to put your lights, unless you're on Broadway and have a million years to tech the show. Um, all of your work for the most part is done in the space. So it's you want to have looked at the script and be able to say, here are all the options I want to have at any given moment for any given thing that might come up, because you never know. You might get in the space, and the way you've thought about it, or the way you've talked about it with the director or the choreographer, um, you guys say, you know what, that's just not working. Let's do this scene, but in a different realized fashion. So options is always a good thing.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm glad you brought up the whole sound and lighting kind of comes in once you get in the space, because that right before I got on with you guys, I was doing a recording for about design, and just in talking that like for me as a prop guy, a lot of my build right now is coming up. I'm working on shows now that their first rehearsal is mid-May, and so I have to do all my work now because they want their props on that first day rehearsal. Whereas like the lighting and sound may not necessarily be looking too much into it until things have gotten further along, and it's just interesting to hear that.
And a lot of even on Broadway, sometimes the lighting designer isn't hired until well after some of the other people have completely finished their work. The set designer sometimes is brought in and has completely finished their portion of the pre-show work before the lighting designer is ever even hired. So it generally speaking, the lighting designer is one of the last people to come into even the pre-production process. And that's all just a financial thing. You don't want to have someone on your payroll that you're paying to even be tangentially involved in the equation any longer than you have to. Even when you've got Broadway money, it's you still have to run into real world cost situations.
It's money. Money is money.
Yeah.
So moving over to moving lights, which in our school we don't have a lot of experience with, but this question is, are there still shows in the professional world that go without moving lights, or have moving lights taken over as the new normal? If they have become a norm, do you think there will get to a point where people will think that they're overused?
So I'm going to start at the end first. There will always be people that think moving lights are overused. And a lot of that depends on how you use them. It's not wrong to have every moving light in the world in your plot, but if you don't need them and you're just doing pointless, if there's not a reason you're doing what you're doing, then that's when it becomes unnecessary and frivolous. You know, everything should have a function. And it, like I was saying before, it's good to have options, but you know, you should still have thought about what you want to do with all of your equipment before you get in space. Because again, it comes back to money. If I can do the job I need to do with 2 or 3 conventional fixtures as opposed to a moving light, you know, it's better to use those conventional fixtures in that sense, because I'm not spending money on a fixture that's significantly more expensive. Um, and then if you think about like a Broadway show or a tour, they're renting these things on much longer term contracts. So you're talking about I can rent 3 moving lights to do this job, or sorry, 3 conventional fixtures to do this job, or 1 moving light. And now if I'm running Hamilton, the tour, that's an open-ended tour. We're talking about a rental that could go on forever at this point, you know.
Yeah.
So that ends up becoming a lot of money. And a lot of, you know, it's a shame, but a lot of things will come down to what does the budget allow for.
So
and you don't ever want to spend money on things you don't need to. But that being said, yes, there are absolutely still any number of professional shows that just have conventional fixtures. There's we do lots and lots of shows up at the theater. There's lots of shows off Broadway. I can't think of any current running Broadway shows that don't have moving lights somewhere, but there's plenty of off Broadway. There's regional theater of all sizes, community theater of all sizes that only use conventional fixtures. And some of it has to do with cost, and some of it has to do with lighting designers don't need it, or maybe you're in a space that doesn't really allow for it. You know, there's a lot of theater going on in New York City and Chicago and big places like that, you know, they're putting on a production sometimes in someone's living room, sometime in a renovated grocery store. So, you know, your power situation may not allow for moving lights, or just the physical space may not allow for it.
and your light board would be another factor, right? I mean, if you had just
Yeah.
an old board that can't support that many addresses or whatever you need for a moving light, I mean, I got to imagine that would be a big deal too.
Yeah, you know, the lighting boards that were kind of 2 generations ago, you could still do some level of moving lights on, like the ETC Obsession series.
Oh, yeah.
You could do them. They were a pain, but you could do it. And I can run a moving light on a 2-scene preset fader console. I'm assigning each parameter of the moving light to a fader.
Right.
So in the end, it's all DMX, and you can do, I can run moving light controls from a device that's called a DMXter, which just outputs DMX. It's a little handheld device normally used for testing things. So can you do it? Yes. Do you want to? Oh, no. But yeah, the moving lights are great. They're a wonderful tool. They've revolutionized the industry.
Yeah.
But they're not essential. You know, my lighting professor always said, if you can't light a show without them, then you have no business being a lighting designer. So they're great, wonderful things to have. Hi, Margaret. But they're not essential. They're not necessary. They're all just tools for helping you tell the story as best you can, based on your vision and the director or choreographer's vision.
Awesome. So this one kind of goes to both of you. You brought up Hamilton, so we'll use that as the example. Is when you have a traveling show or anything that is going around the country, do the light cues change within the show, or do they mostly stay the same? And the same would be, I would say that this question would also relate to sound as well, is when they show up into a new space, they come here to DPAC, and even though DPAC is a really it's a great facility. There's going to be something different with the physical structure of the building, right? So, do your light cues and sound cues still stay the same?
For lighting, basically, yes. The cue structure stays the same. Generally, what you do for lighting is you create what's called focus points on your console, and as long as I know where center is, and my stage, and the good thing about these touring shows is they normally are bringing in a stage floor, all the surrounding hard legs, scenery, everything is coming in off the truck. So as long as you know where a reference point for center is, the light cue in the first number is always going to be 4 feet up and 3 feet left of center. So you just have to reference back to a certain point. So that makes, and that's another thing that moving lights are great for. You can do the same thing with conventional fixtures where you're just hanging the same truss and hopefully nothing's gotten moved. But that's what stage managers on tours do. Because the lighting designer doesn't travel with the show. It's actually the stage manager on the tours that calls those lighting.
So I have a scenario then, and then I want to hear Brian with the same question. Is I was working on Motley Crue and Kiss when they came through. I mean, at this point it was 2013 or something like that. They came through together, and when we did it at Walnut Creek, and when we were loading it on stage, the production manager said normally this is done in an arena, and he said it's just hard because now we have to move our gear into this space. So like, how do they adjust for that when it comes to lighting? Because you have what you would normally do in an arena like PNC, and now you're going to do it in something like Walnut Creek. So how would you go about adjusting for that?
For a show like that, it's a little bit different. For something like Hamilton, like we were talking about before, they are meeting with the representatives from Hamilton, are talking to the representatives from the venue ages before this.
Okay.
So they're talking about and figuring out how this will fit in, what will work well before you get there. With rock and roll concerts, it's a little different. Generally they're just going to cut what doesn't fit and keep what works, keep what they can. Rock and roll is a little bit more on the fly, kind of by its nature.
Yeah.
So it's we might have 3 trusses in the arena. We're only going to do it with 2 on this, or maybe we don't have all the lighting towers or something. They reduce it to fit in the space that they have, and that's the challenge of working on a tour. You're mounting the same show over and over. So there's not as much creativity in that. It's just making the same thing work in a different space each time.
And they're having conversations. That's part I didn't know that. So the tour people are having a discussion with the venue people. You're talking about like months, weeks in advance.
For a Broadway tour, we advance these things. Broadway tours 9, 10, sometimes more, 12 months out. We start advancing some of these things.
Oh, I had no clue.
For the smaller, for regional theaters like North Carolina Theater, when they come in, we're advancing with them to some extent, several months out. Sometimes if they're bringing in a designer, if it's a regional theater type thing, I'm having conversations with them further out because they have to have their designs due and all. But yeah, we spend a lot of time advancing shows. And we have a tech writer as a venue that says, here's what we provide, here's what our space is. Our stage is this by this, our grid height is this. We have these amenities, we can rent in these amenities, all of our information. And then the shows each have a tech writer as well that says, here's what we need to do the show. Here are the places we can compromise X, Y, Z. but here's what we'd love to have, and here's what we have to have. And then every space is different. So it's always a conversation between normally the head carpenter and the head lighting person, the department heads for the tour, and then if you have them, the department heads either for your venue or some production representative.
Interesting. Okay, well, that's awesome. Thank you, Brian. How about in the sound world? Do they travel with I mean, I gotta imagine they have a program that they travel with the same type of cues and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, so that and the front end of it, console programming, QLab, that's all built, and that's going to be the same in every venue. They might have to go into an amp and say, oh, well, this venue's 600 seats smaller or not as deep, so we need to turn everything down just a tiny bit. But from a programming standpoint, that's all locked in. Same with their mics and all of that backstage. The one big thing that does change from venue to venue is the PA. And depending on the scale of the tour will determine how much of that changes from each venue. Something like Hamilton, not only is the venue coordinating with someone in New York who we're sending them a rendering of the room, and someone in New York is saying, okay, well, when you go into this space, the PA has to be at these angles and this attenuation. And then there is someone on the tour whose job is specifically to come in, a week before the tour arrives in advance and start looking at the space and make all of that functional. Sometimes, in rare instances, like I believe with DPAC, the system was brand new. It's very well designed. So the guys from Hamilton came in and said, yeah, we can use these parts of your system. We don't have to hang up this part of our system. When you get to smaller budget, lower scale tours, your second and third nationals, they usually come in with a line array that's in a pre-built tower. So they don't have to worry about motor points and hanging. They stack the towers, and they just have to adjust the line array in sections instead of each individual box, because a lot of those tours are focused on getting in and out and not being there for more than a couple days. A lot of them there for one night. They come in at 7 a.m. By noon, they're expected to be set up and ready to go to sound check and do whatever they need to. And then they're out of there at 11 o'clock that night, packing up. And so in those cases, the people who built it design it for both its functionality as a sound system, but also its ease of construction. How quickly can we get this in and out of a place?
Awesome. Thank you.
So, Tim,
yeah.
The other thing that we didn't really touch on there is most modern tours are using show control now, which is networking a lot of these systems together. That it's networking sound together with lighting, together with video. So, you have to keep all the same cues doing the same things, because maybe something Brian's controlling out in the sound world is triggering a lighting effect, or is triggering video, or vice versa. So, show control is a big part of a modern show, and it's a lot of networking between the different disciplines and systems.
And that's a program?
It is. It's different protocols based on what your show and what your needs are. But sometimes you have a lighting console or a sound console that's triggering through MIDI or SMPTE, or by way of a media server or something like that, other things that are going on. If Brian has a really cool thunder clap, and we want to have lightning striking at the same time, instead of trying to line up our presses of the go button, we would just maybe MIDI those together or something. And the same goes now with video and even automations, scenic automation stuff. And it's all triggered from the same thing. So it's really important that we do keep the same, especially for these tours, the same cue structure in place all the time, because all of these things are very codependent now.
Okay, and then that would bring up I guess that would a lot of that would be solved in those conversations that the venue would have with the touring staff if you were moving from a 1,200 seat theater down to a 600 seat theater, and you had to change your rig for some reason for that. You'd keep your cues the same, but you may have to do something different with some of your lighting. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, for the theater shows, like I said, we're going to keep all the same lights. We just might, the front of house balcony position might be in a slightly different XYZ axis.
Okay.
But it's still there. It's still doing its job. It's still all linked back to the system the same way. And but show control is a big part, and especially even, like I said, stage automation now and rigging stuff is even included in it. If you go to, especially these theaters out in Vegas where they've got some of the Cirque shows, it is all part of the same system now. It's all controlled by a media server. Everything from the curtain moves to the scenic deck track moves, it's all controlled by the same system now.
Interesting.
It's actually added some new disciplines that I don't think any of us planned on having to learn when we started doing this.
Yeah.
My dogs are clawing at the door. I'm sorry.
It's fine. Luke can attest to this. A big part of my job that I did not ever think was going to be part of my job is networking at this point. When we do these NCT shows, we set up a show control network that has to hit everywhere backstage. It's how we can view what's going on with our wireless mics. It's how we run video all through the venue. So if the stage manager needs a shot from above the stage for whatever reason, we're responsible for making that happen. Lighting designer needs a shot at front of house so he can see whatever he needs to see. We make that happen. It all goes through all of this networking protocol these days.
Huh. All right. Interesting. That's a lot. That's a ton of information I didn't know. Brian, I've got a couple of quick ones here for you. As I look at the time, I think I may have to go with you, Luke, and say we may have to do another one of these another time because I've got so many things we just keep talking. So a quick one here is, in your opinion, Brian, where's the best place to put mic tape on a microphone on an actor with a maximum of 4 pieces of slim mic tape being used? I don't know what he's asking. We do some that the mic is set here, and then we do some where we actually set it up here. Right. Do you have a preference of location here? And when if you have a preference, where would you put the tape for one of those?
It is entirely dependent. Ideally, I'd prefer a forehead rig, but the situation isn't always ideal. Someone's wearing a hat, or in cases like yours, you're working in a space where that means you're going to have to turn it up more to pick up. Whereas if you're doing an ear rig, the closer you are to the mouth, the more you're picking up without having to turn it up as far. That being said, in the case of a forehead, we use usually 2 pay clips or bobby pins to weave it into the hair and hide it. A single piece just under the hairline. And we get, my policy is I get that mic as low as I can until someone, the director or wig makeup, complains that it's too low and visible.
Yeah.
And then just a single piece of tape on the back of the neck with the person, looking down at their feet so that there's plenty of stretch to the cable. In the case of an ear rig, I usually do 1 piece sort of just behind, right at the edge of the ear. I try not to go onto the face because there's no way of making that look good, especially once you throw makeup at it. Then usually, say we're putting it on my left ear, I put the 1 piece here, have them turn this way, a piece right behind the ear, and then I take that cable, follow their hairline, have them look down, and a tape piece on the back of their neck. So I usually
is your mic just right here at the ear then, or do you bring the mic all the way down to the face?
It depends. Either way, we usually build specialized ear rigs. You can get fairly cheap little plastic or aluminum ear-shaped devices.
Right. Yep.
We use floral wire to attach, and that floral wire keeps the microphone element stiff. So if I need to extend it this far,
Oh,
And
brilliant.
it's got the wire on it, so it's staying stiff. I'm just putting the piece here to make sure the rig stays secured to their ear.
Now that one, hopefully Jacob is making note right now, and then our young guys, as they're watching this, however many weeks down the road here, is the floral wire. That is brilliant, because that's been one of our big things. Is that we've got some that have the wire in it and they can be rigid, but then we've got others where they're doing this, and so we have to tape down here. So now what you're telling me is if we tape back here and we have the floral wire, it'll hold it in place. That's brilliant. I'm going to use that.
Let's see, I'm trying to remember. So yeah, if you were to just Google the phrase microphone ear rig, one of your first links is to Mask Sound, who have a little tutorial page on how to do that, and they're one of the industry leaders. They came up with a lot of how this is done. There's certainly exceptions, but they sort of came up with this initial concept of how to do an ear rig for a Broadway microphone.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. So we do, in our class, we do, in Tech Ones, we do a lot of Foley. He was asking, like, when it comes to sound effects and things like that, we use freesound.org. Do you have any other sites that you use? Because I know, like, when I talk to Eric Collins, he talks about Freesound and things like that. Is there other places you go for your sound effects?
Freesound is a great resource. There's another one called Sound Dogs that is very similar in concept. Depending on the level of theater, what kind of theater you're doing, there are other options. The BBC recently released its entire catalog of sound effects, free to download so long as you're not using them commercially. So for a school, it's great. We could not use it for North Carolina theater.
Okay.
And then between myself and other designers, we all have just, we don't delete any sound effect once we've built it. It gets thrown into a folder that says thunder or gunshots. So next time we need that, we can start with one we've already got instead of building something brand new every single time. And so I can call Eric and say, hey, man, I know you had this really complex falling down the stairs sound effect for whatever show. I need something like that. Could you send that my way? And, he's happy to do it.
Awesome.
And I know it's mildly off topic, but video kind of works the same way. There's a lot of great free video content resources that you in a scholastic situation can use without any copyright issues that would plague some of our other clients. But it's the same thing, there's great resources, but then there's also great paid resources. Or I know a lot of my friends that do video design work on the regular have a lot of basic effects and short loops and stuff like that they are willing to share with their friends and co-workers. So it's a similar situation if you guys ever get into video for that stuff. So
we're starting to kind of make a way. Like, I know my Tech Ones, I do a Foley project where they can take a 2.5 minute film clip, and we take out the sound, and then they have to build their own sound effects into it. And I know that, there's a discussion for another day, but one of the things I have to work on, I have to figure out, is we don't have the equipment yet to be able to have them get the sounds coordinated with the image and then record it so that we can just play it. So right now, I run the film clip on the movie screen, take out that sound, and then they plug in the aux cable into their computer, and we use SoundPlant on the computer screen so that they can put the sound specifically into the keys, right? And then they just hit the sound keys as they're watching it on the screen. So right now, that's kind of my best way of getting around that one.
So what you could look at is using a program like QLab, and then any sound effect you can build. And Brian knows so much more than I do. If you build it however you do, as long as you're starting and you have beats that are happening on frame rate things, then it's easy to kind of link those together, and then you can within QLab extend something or not or
So I'm glad you brought up QLab, because Brian, you you both probably have knowledge on what I can do with this. Is that I use SoundPlant right now because QLab is a Mac program. Is that right? And so when like everything that we have, at least in our public school system, is a what do you say, Microsoft. And so I can't run the same program, which is, and that's actually one of the questions that my sound guy put on here is basically is QLab what is used in the real world? Because of learning from you guys, I've always heard that QLab is what you guys use in the professional world. Is that about right?
Yeah, QLab is very much the go-to these days, especially for sound effects, and also with video as well. A lot of tours are coming through, and it's all fired from one computer, but it's taking care of audio cues and video cues. I cannot remember the last theatrical tour I saw come through that did not have QLab. Certainly we get concerts that are using some other software that functions very much the same way. But from a theatrical standpoint, everyone I know uses QLab. And
even if you're using a different program for video, if you're using something like Watch Out or Pandora, any of those things, you can still run all of your sound cues through QLab, and they share a protocol, and it's easy to link those those different systems so that they are all firing, getting back to show control, kind of firing things at the same time. Because that really, like I said, show control is definitely the way the world is moving, and has been for a long time. But
yeah, I'm going to
just
look into
adding
that.
more and more to it. So
Awesome. So, I mean, I could keep going. I've got questions, but I want to try to keep them to an hour. And then I think to kind of end this particular session, there's a couple of questions here that I think are pretty cool. And I think that there are things that might be a good way to kind of round it all out. Is that what is one thing you wish you knew before entering the theater business? And when was the moment you knew that you chose the right career?
Brian.
So the latter question's a little bit easier to answer. I wouldn't say there was a defining moment, but I've always wanted a career in the arts, and by the time I was in high school, I realized that career belonged behind the proscenium, not in front of it. And for me, I've always said, if there is anything else you could be doing for a living, then do that. Because it is a hard job. It is a thankless job sometimes. They were long hours.
That's rude. How dare you?
I say this to my boss. And if you're very lucky and you work really hard, you can make a living at it. But I think that is more the exception than the rule. By all means, if you enjoy doing it, please participate in your local theaters. But if there is anything else you can be doing that you'd be happy doing, don't try and do professional theater. As for, I don't think I really have anything I wish I had known before I got into it, because like I said, my background was like 12 or 13. I started lugging gear for my father, and came into it that way.
Luke, same two questions.
So let's see. Things I wish I knew beforehand. I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I mean, I think if you have a curious mind, you'll go further in this business. Because this is an industry that is always changing, always evolving, always bringing in and incorporating new technologies. if you're into the more technological fields, like lighting and sound, but if you're into props and scenery and costuming and any of the, I mean, you're still need to be learning new construction techniques and new building techniques um, and maybe you're learning a new method for getting some really good scumbling painting stuff, something like that. So I think you need to always be willing to learn new things. So I don't know that there's any one thing I can say right now I wish I knew, because I'm always trying to learn new things. And I think if you have that kind of hunger for growth and development and knowledge, you'll go further in this industry. I don't know anyone, honestly, that is I consider good at their job in theater that isn't a curious person by nature.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know what my moment for knowing this was the right job for me. I didn't come at this in the same way Brian did. I never did this in high school or anything like that. I had worked as a contract electrician's assistant in high school to pay my bills, and I needed a job after I graduated high school to pay my bills, and I happened to luck into getting a job as an electrician, um, and made enough money at it somehow right away that it was viable, and have grown and or fallen into every opportunity that has come my way since then. The I don't, other than my current position, which is only because it's a full-time position with the city of Raleigh, so it's a government job. This is the only job I've ever applied for in theater. The rest of them I've gotten through knowing people, working with people, be it other technicians or designers or directors or choreographers. So I don't know that there was one moment. I just kind of have been very lucky, and but I think a lot of that is helped by the fact that I'm a curious person. And again, I think, like I was saying much earlier, if you enjoy problem solving, um, and sometimes problem solving under extreme duress, this can be a good job for you.
Yeah, the funny thing is you both bring up points that I've brought up in my classes where Brian, I'm like, if you want to make a ton of money at this, you've got basically two places to go. I mean, really, is New York or LA, and you just got to work your butt off to get into them, and you can make money.
Or corporate.
Or corporate. You're right. You're right. I mean, they're venues to go. They're avenues to go. But Brian's right, man.
You can absolutely make money doing corporate work.
Yeah.
Just
I made lots of money doing corporate. I just did not like it as much.
It's a little soul crushing after a while.
I also bring up to my students that, for me at least, in my professional life, is the attitude that people have. Where, kind of piggybacking on what you're saying, Luke, is having that natural curiosity, but it's the willingness to learn, like you say, and the openness to it. Because I'm sure you guys have come across it. I know I have, where I've had people that they already think they know everything about it, and people end up like not really wanting to work with you.
Yeah.
So
this is a very
Luke,
small industry.
Yeah.
So you can only burn so many bridges before you don't have any work left available to you.
That's right. And I've been very fortunate, like you too, is in a lot of my jobs, it's just been word of mouth, and then somebody says, "Hey, you're a prop guy, and come on over." So yeah, I chalk it up to, at least for me anyway, it's all about the willingness to learn and not being a jerk.
Yeah.
Anyway.
You'll work with people that are just terrible to work with on some days, but like, since this is such a small industry, I mean, if it's something you can't tolerate, then you can't tolerate it, and that's okay. Yep. But if you can work your way through bad situations, sometimes it's just a person's having a bad day, or some other outside circumstances that you're not aware of. And maybe they'll remember that later. I've had people that I hated working with and I thought they hated working with me that later down the line offered me a job and said, you know what, I was just having a bad day, week, month,
Yeah.
whatever, going through something at that point, and you really handled that professionally, and I enjoyed working with you. And I, like I said, I think I thought these people hated working with me, and it turns out that it had nothing to do with me. It was just the scenario, and they really appreciated how I handled things, and that got me jobs later on. So
Yeah, I've certainly been in that boat as well. Same thing, and you work with them again, or you talk to other people. You're like, God, that guy was mean, and like, oh no, he's a totally cool dude, and
yeah,
you just that day, whatever it was, and I'm like, all right, and again, for me anyway, it goes back to the attitude. Is I give everybody the benefit of the doubt, and if they're kind of grumpy on particular shows or whatever, I'll work with them again, and then I'll see them in a totally different light, and I'm like, all right, the obviously. There's something going on in that last show, but I hate to say it, but I need to be done with this one
Yeah.
and set up for the next one. I really enjoyed this. I really appreciate you guys doing this.
absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and hit stop record now and see how that goes. It's not wanting to stop recording. Maybe when I hang up, it'll stop. But I do appreciate you guys doing this, though. I really
Absolutely. Yeah, if you want to do another one, just let me know. And I guess I will see you at 2:30 for the production one anyways.
Yeah, sounds great. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Take
Thanks,
care.
Tim.
Thank you.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
And then it was just us.
Well, this is nice.
Guess what?
What?
4 days.
I know. In fact, because I pre-installed it.
Did you? How did you do that?
Because PlayStation Network is limiting download bandwidth, Square released it a week early. So you can download and install it, but it's content locked.
That's
so you
fine.
can't actually play it.
Because I canceled my physical copy and I pre-ordered it on PlayStation Store, so I can do that?
Yeah, so you can go on the store, and then anytime you look at its icon, it has a countdown timer telling you how long till it's available to play.
No, because I did get the wallpaper.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah.
I bought some Crunch bars and got all the things.
All right. Well, I'm excited.
I am too.
All right.
This was fun.
Yep. Talk to you soon.
Yep. Talk to you soon.
I don't know how to get out of this, but I'm just gonna close everything.
Yeah, leave call.